Good afternoon. My name is Michael Volpe. I'm a partner at Venable LLP, and welcome to another webcast in a series of presentations by our law firm on topics pertaining to the new administration that's coming into office in Washington and its first 100 days. We're going to be joined today by the Honorable Bart Stupak and Josh Feinstone from our legislative group. Before we jump into the political issues and the labor and employment law issues, which is the topic of today's webcast, a few general comments. First, don't be distracted by the Washington Nationals memorabilia behind Josh or the Packers memorabilia behind Congressman Stupak. I don't have any memorabilia behind me, but I can assure you the Yankees have won 27 World Series. Next, and importantly, we were supposed to do this about 3.5 weeks ago, and we decided to postpone it because of the uncertainty of the election, but also because there were going to be further developments on the various topical areas that the firm was going to cover. And in the labor and employment law space, when you hear from Josh and Bart and myself, I think you're going to see that the little bit of delay that we've had here was probably worth it. There are going to be some really interesting decisions in the next days, weeks, for example, regarding labor secretary and who will serve in that capacity. We can get into that a little bit later. There is going to be some really interesting thinking going into other initiatives that will be undertaken by the administration immediately upon being sworn into office. For example, what executive orders that were revoked by President Trump or put into place by President Trump will be changed by President Biden. So what we'd like to do today is kick off by having Bart speak to you a little bit about where we stand today politically, and then Josh go through some of the mechanics of how the elections turned out and how that situates the House and the Senate, and then we'll jump into the labor and employment law topics. So, Bart, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Mike, and it's a pleasure to be with everybody. It's been a very interesting election. Fortunately, we only have every 4 years a presidential election, and because, Mike, if I count those 27 world championships, that would be well past the history of our country or the age of our country. But anyways, if we get back to this last election here, very interesting one. Despite the president's 46-minute press conference yesterday, Joe Biden did win. Joe Biden will receive 306 electoral votes come January the 6th, when the U.S. House actually, 117th Congress, January 6th, Wednesday, actually do tally the votes and are they're presented on the House floor for debate, and actually it's a joint session, so it'll be ratified then. But the election really had mixed results. I mean, the Democrats were looking to pick up 5 to 15 seats in the House. They ended up losing approximately 11 or 12 seats. There's 1 or 2 that seats are decided, like one is by 6 votes, another one is like 12 votes. So needless to say, there are recounts and legal challenges going on. But the point is, Speaker Pelosi is going to have the slimmest Democratic majority ever, at least in modern history. She's going to end up with about 222 votes, 221, depending on how these challenges go. But you need 218 to pass anything. So it certainly emboldens a number of more moderate members of the Democratic Party to negotiate more and to hold out for their votes until they have practical, reasonable legislation and not extreme legislation. And the Senate itself, you see it's close, 50-48 with Georgia yet to go. So what does all this mean? This election, a close Senate, a very close House, well-seasoned veteran going to be our president of the United States. I think it really forces more bipartisanship, and I think you see a little bit of it coming about just yesterday when President-elect Biden urged Minority Leader Schumer and Speaker Pelosi to accept a bipartisan plan that a couple of Democrats and a couple of Republican senators put together. It wasn't the $2 trillion COVID relief package that Speaker Pelosi's been insisting upon for the last 6 months. Instead, it's about $905 billion, and it hits the highlights. But a bipartisan group in the Senate was able to do it. Joe Biden jumped in and urged Pelosi and Schumer to accept it, And they had a press conference last night saying they're going to do it. The other thing, Joe Biden knows all these senators pretty much, probably 97 of the 100 senators that'll be there. He's worked with them. So he should be able to work with them and in a professional manner. His cabinet picks thus far have been very professional, well-seasoned veterans in both their industries that they're going to be looking after, but also in government, very seasoned people. And I think you get better results and more bipartisan work because we know each other and respect each other. So the 117th Congress will start on January 3rd, which is a Sunday. They still have to report, and they actually have votes on Sunday, January 3rd, first day of the session set by the Constitution. And then, like I said, on Wednesday, they'll do the Electoral College in a joint session. But talk a little bit more about the election. Let me throw it over to our friend, Josh Feinstein. Josh?
Yeah, thanks, Congressman. I appreciate that. And to kind of continue level setting, kind of where we are headed when the Congress reconvenes on January 3rd, and then, of course, when President-elect Biden is sworn in on January 20th. Some of the things that you can expect to happen is indicated on how things shook out with this election. And so as the Congressman said, as we all know, the President-elect won 306 votes. Over in the Senate, we have a 50-48 GOP lead with 2 seats remaining. That's because in Georgia, we had 1 seat that was up for its normal 6-year term, and we also had a special election to fill a vacancy from Senator Johnny Isakson, who resigned. And when that happened, and neither one of those races got to a 50+1 threshold, you have a scenario now where Georgia, which has traditionally been a Republican seat, Joe Biden won Georgia. And so in this runoff scenario, you have 2 very credible Democrat candidates running against one incumbent and one that's been sitting in that seat for a good while now. And while many people think that this probably leans towards the Republicans, if there's a chance that the Democrats can flip those 2 seats, then you have a scenario where you, instead of having a 52-48 Senate majority for Republicans, you have a 50-50 split. And that, coupled with the House of Representatives maintaining in Democrat hands, would give Democrats tremendous power to wield an agenda and put legislation on the floor. And so Georgia becomes pivotal to how the Biden administration is able to roll out, whether or not they can do things through executive order or whether or not they can do things through legislative process, how fast they can get their cabinet, the types of individuals who can pass into these cabinet positions. All of those things are tied together. And so the outcome of the Georgia election will be pivotal. Further, in the House of Representatives, as Congressman Stupak said, you've got a situation where it's likely going to be about 223 to 212. That is a very slim margin. And as the Congressman was discussing, you're going to have a return to some bipartisan notes. You're going to have moderate Dems and moderate Rs working together. And that's going to change some of the dynamics that we've seen out of the House of Representatives under both Republican and Democrat majorities, where they have been much more into the 230 seats, even upwards of 240s. And they've been able to ram whatever they want through and then really fight with the Senate. The House is going to be much more like the Senate in that if it does not have bipartisan support, it won't be able to get to the finish line. And so where do we see the next few weeks and months coming before we head into an election inauguration? You've certainly got government funding running dry on December 11th. There's talk of another COVID bill. There's the National Defense Authorization Act. These members do not want to be in D.C. due to the COVID pandemic. So you have a scenario where a lot needs to get done. Members don't want to be here. They absolutely would like to get home with enough time to quarantine so they can see their kids and loved ones. And so, and on top of all that, we don't know if Trump's going to sign any bills that come to him. And so you've got a lot for time to deal with either a veto and override that veto, or a pocket veto. And the pocket veto is more of the reason driving the noon adjournment. The 11:59 adjournment on January 3rd, and then the reconvening at noon on that Sunday. Normally, what you could do is pass a law and punch that into Monday or Tuesday. But if you do convene and you have 24 hours, President Trump could fill a host of appointments through recess appointments. And so there's no opportunity that the Democrats want to give him to do that. And so it's a very interesting set of circumstances that we find ourselves in. But that's kind of the lay of the land. That's where we see the next 60 days going. And depending on how Georgia goes, there will be some smaller latitude or wider latitude for the Biden administration and some of the things that they may want to do through executive order or through legislation. And to talk a little bit about where they might go, let's kick it back to Mike. Mike, thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Before we get into the potential legislative initiatives, I thought it would be instructive to at least talk about who the current frontrunners are for labor secretary, which, as we all know and the audience knows, can have a major impact on labor and employment law in the United States in the years to come. So currently, what we see is there are a number of potential candidates. Some of the major unions, the steelworkers, the UFCW, the SEIU, are pushing Mayor Walsh from Boston. Mayor Walsh used to be part of the laborers union. He was actually very involved in organizing with the laborers union. And many of the large unions would love to see him as the labor secretary. There's been a recent report that former Representative Finkenauer out of Iowa, who just lost her race in a fairly close race, has a chance. That would be a very interesting pick, an extremely young person for a cabinet position, not a lot of time in Washington, and would be a very interesting pick. There's also a large push, and maybe Congressman Stupak should comment on this, about Andy Levin from Michigan, a former trade union organizer who's now in Congress. His name has come up recently as a potential labor secretary. And of course, then there are two of the sort of names that have been bandied about the most, from my perspective, as the chair of a labor and employment law group at a fairly large law firm in the United States. Julie Su, the California Labor Secretary, founder of Sweatshop Watch, very active in progressive union organizing efforts and employee protection efforts. And then the, what I would say, the 64,000-pound gorilla as among the candidates, Senator Sanders. If nothing else, it would make for wonderful Saturday Night Live episodes if Senator Sanders became the labor secretary and started to push some of the very progressive socialist policies that he has advocated for over the years. So before we move on from the Secretary of Labor, Bart, any comments on any of the candidates or your thoughts as a former congressman, where we could end up there?
Sure. I still think the two frontrunners are Bernie Sanders and Julie Su. Andy Levin, well, it's an interesting pick. He comes from a difficult seat in Michigan for the Democrats to hold. And with the slim majority, they really couldn't afford to lose Congressman Levin. And that just reduces their majority by another one. And I think that would not be wise. So I wouldn't be surprised if Julie Su gets the position, fills a president keeps saying, President-elect Biden keeps saying it's going to look like America. Well, Julie Su would certainly help it look more and more like America. Bernie Sanders, it'd be a great capping of his career. I just don't see that one. I think it's going to be Julie Su, and the outside shot, I think, is Bernie.
Interesting. Josh, any thoughts on the potential labor secretary?
No, I would absolutely agree with the congressman. There is zero room to remove anybody in the House of Representatives in the Democrat majority. One, you have to get Speaker Pelosi to get 218 votes on the floor of the House. That is the number one priority for Pelosi. and two, yeah, it's just too slim. I can't imagine that there's any appetite from the Democrats in the House to lose a vote. Then, notwithstanding any merit by Congressman Levin, while I'm a Republican, I understand he's a tremendous representative, smart individual, knows the issues. Certainly not an issue of qualifications. It is all tactics. It's all blocking and tackling on the field, and this would be a huge blow to the Democrats to where it almost disqualifies them.
Thank you both. So let's turn to some of the employment and labor law topics that we could see addressed by the Biden administration in mid-January. And some people may say, well, wait a minute, how are they going to do anything right away in mid-January? First and foremost, as was mentioned by my colleagues, there's an effort to have another bill done, maybe a bipartisan bill in Congress. It might be done before the end of the year. And in connection therewith, as we saw in prior bills, there is certainly going to be funding for employers and some of the issues they've faced across the country during the pandemic. The Biden administration will likely take initiatives to make certain that PPE, personal protective equipment, is available for employees and the employers across the country. There may be a nationwide mask mandate. There's lots of legal issues around that. We could see more stringent enforcement of OSHA and CDC recommendations. And we could see, if not a national shutdown order, influence on states to shut down in the face of whatever we encounter in the coming weeks and months. The prior pieces of legislation that we saw in basically the spring, early summer, touched upon financial issues, provided funding for certain leaves and unemployment insurance and other things. There could be some more of that, which will obviously affect employers and employees. But the big issue here that I see from an employment law and labor law perspective will turn on PPE and staffing. There are a number of labor disputes that have been on the news in the last few days, actually, in the Northeast and in the West and the Midwest. Healthcare workers out protesting on strike, leafleting, or doing informational picketing, indicating that they still don't have enough PPE and or don't have enough staffing. So we could see some federal initiatives in those areas. We could see some more mandatory testing issues. And when the vaccine comes out, there's an interesting issue being bandied about mandatory vaccines and the legal issues that employers will confront with requiring everyone to take vaccines, have vaccines before coming into work. That would be, I would say, labor and employment topic number one, and it touches on both employment law in terms of pay for employees, leave for employees, absences of employees, staffing of employees, PPE for employees, employment law and labor law on the strike and informational picketing, leafleting, protesting to get what employees and unions, their union representatives feel are right. I would say that when we turn to the bigger areas that Joe Biden has indicated he will push for as president once sworn in, a good transition would be to talk now about union organizing. The PRO Act, the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, is something that Joe Biden has said he would sign into law if it's presented to him. This had passed the Democratic House. Biden was an original co-sponsor of the Employee Free Choice Act. And then under the Obama-Biden administration, there was an attempt to get that into law that did not go forward. And effectively what the PRO Act or the Employee Free Choice Act do is they make it easier to organize employees in any workplace. Now, what's interesting about the PRO Act is not only would it take what are called card checks and make them lawful and require employers to abide by card check election processes or representation processes. But under the PRO Act, and Joe Biden supports this, to the extent that an employer tries to prevent union organizing, Joe Biden would be supportive of fining companies, severely fining companies, and potentially there's talk of having elements of the law that would require criminal prosecution if you could prove that an employer and its executives intentionally prevented union organizing. That would be a dramatic difference from the labor laws that we've all known for many, many years. So this would be one area that you can anticipate coming up right away, right out of the box. The major unions that I mentioned before, the SEIU, UFCW, and others all support this, and it is likely that there'll be an effort to get this law passed. Whether or not it would get past the Senate, Josh, I think it was Josh who mentioned the issues that are going to arise in the Senate in the next few weeks. There'll probably have to be another one of these calls after that, those elections in January. So we'll see some union organizing and union support by the Biden administration. I'd be remiss if I don't mention if there's any public employer representatives on this program, that there's also something that Joe Biden supports called the Public Service Freedom to Negotiate Act, which supports the right of public employees to bargain collectively and negotiate terms and conditions of employment. And he has been very supportive of that. So other sort of substantive areas that I thought it would be important to mention today before we go back to Josh and the congressman for comments. We will see under the Biden administration, sort of a very interesting topic. There have been some laws over the last few years under the Obama administration and state laws dealing with restrictive covenants that apply to employees and people post-employment, protecting employers from competition or protecting trade secrets and other information from being disclosed when an individual goes from one employer to another. Joe Biden strongly opposes restrictive covenant agreements. He believes they hinder the ability of individuals to go seek higher wages, better benefits, better working conditions for themselves and their families. And he has indicated that he would push for legislation that would seek to eliminate non-competition agreements. Of course, he's supportive of confidentiality and trade secret arrangements, but the idea is to allow there to be freedom of movement within the workplaces. And there's also talk of there being legislation that would implement a ban on no poaching agreements. In other words, where companies agree to not have competition, if you will, for their workforces as between each other. Biden has indicated that he would seek to implement an outright ban on such no poaching agreements. These issues have a big effect on perhaps one of the biggest growing parts of our economy, that is the sort of the gig economy. And it's very significant because the competition in that industry, in that sphere, is vast and fierce. And some of these nuances, restrictive covenants, non-competition agreements, confidentiality agreements, trade secret agreements, have been in place. Some people say to balance the playing field, level the playing field from one employer to the next. We know that in that space we have very, very large companies that can dominate. And you could argue that on both sides of this, there could be more or less competition by making these changes. On the gig economy front, and not just limited to gig economy, but this is where it emanates from, Biden plans to aggressively pursue employers who intentionally misclassify individuals or employees as independent contractors. He would try to come up with simpler, cleaner, sort of more straightforward legislation distinguishing between employees and independent contractors, or making bright line tests between employees and independent contractors. And he would try to make the misclassification violations more punishable under the federal labor laws and tax laws. So in other words, additional penalties beyond those that we have seen already. And we could probably see, under a new labor secretary, increased funding for the types of investigations into gig economy employers and independent contracting classifications than we have seen in the past. Congressman Stupak, any comments on the gig economy and or thoughts on the gig economy and the possibility of the Labor Department and the Secretary of Labor having more at her disposal to do these types of investigations?
I agree. They'll take every resource that they can find at their disposal to do these investigations, to, as the president would say, crack down on misclassification of employees and free up employees to move from one employer to the other, if that's what they so choose. The other thing I think that dovetails into just about everything you're saying, Mike, is these essential employees, President Biden or President-elect Biden has made a big deal about them, but they're essential, so why don't we pay them a wage that is essential? It sort of goes with the Democratic theme of, a livable wage, where most parts of the country now is probably up to $15 an hour, and most people scoff at that and think it should be at least $20 an hour. And when you talk about Andy Levin, a possible Secretary of Labor, he has a bill in there to give the essential workers extra money. And so where do you define essential workers? Is it frontline healthcare workers, or is it the person stocking the shelves in the stores? Who pays for that? Is that going to be in a COVID relief bill, or is it going to be a supplemental cost to employers? And not just Andy Levin, but Gary Peters, my home state again, Michigan, he actually had a bill in there that he introduced, like a $25,000 bonus for the essential workers. So I think you're going to see pressure from the Secretary of Labor and from the administration to do something about wages. Josh, I'd throw it to you on some of these things, but there's an area where I just think they're going to be a hard charge to increase wages in this country. Well,
let's frame the issue this way, Josh, before you jump into it. So President-elect Biden has specifically said that he would support a federal $15 an hour minimum wage. We've seen that. I think we started to see that first in Seattle. There's been, who you talk to, but mixed results with that. And we've seen it in other states. In New York, there's a scaled minimum wage. New York City being higher than the outlying counties in the upstate New York, and other states have done similar things. So I'd ask you, Josh, where do you see those legislative efforts? But also, significantly, the administration under Biden may seek to eliminate sort of the federal minimum wage for tipped employees, what's called a tip credit. And to Bart's very good point, this is a real important topic for employers. And frankly, some employees don't want that to change. If you, maybe not right now in the pandemic, but if you happen to be in an industry, a restaurant or another service providing industry where the tips are quite good, you want to stay with the lower hourly wage and the higher tips in terms of your potential for good earnings or higher earnings remaining. So Josh, thoughts on those topics?
Mike, just if I jump in quick, DC actually had that on the ballot, and that they would get a minimum wage as opposed to the tips. And most of the waiters, bartenders, waitresses I've spoke to, that they were not in favor of it, but yet it passed overwhelmingly because the tip credit, it's hard to explain to the ordinary voter on the street. That's a really good point on the tip credit. And you're seeing it in LA, you saw it in Washington, D.C. They haven't implemented it yet in Washington, D.C., taking away the tip and putting in a minimum wage. But it really has a lot of impact. I know the owners of these establishments are scared to death. They're going to have to raise their prices and just drive away business, especially at a time during a pandemic. Again, there wasn't a pandemic when they voted on it, but there is now. How your business is way down? How would you even come out of you're so far in the hole economically if you're a restaurant or a small business owner, and now they're going to put this tip law or a minimum wage of $15 to $20 an hour. That's just not going to make it. Josh, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's quite all right. So, Mike, your question really boils down to whether or not a legislative initiative is going to be able to make it through, or whether or not it's going to have to be a rule, and what are the caveats to getting that rule through. And it comes back to Georgia. It comes back to whether or not this is going to be a 52-48 Senate majority or it's going to be a 50-50. Now, let's explore that from both angles. If you've got a 52-48, and I think that that's more likely than anything else, perhaps a 51-49, but I think that you're going to have Senate GOP control. So for some of these things, you're going to have to really find out quickly from the administration how important are these things, because you're not going to get everything, but you could get some things, and it depends on how much weight you want to put behind it and what your order is in your agenda. And for everything that you want to push through or lean on Mitch McConnell to accept, you got to bet he's going to get something for it. So what is that trade-off? How does that look like? How long does that take to kind of work itself through the system? And then, of course, you're going to have to get a lot of people to sign off on that. So even if you have a McConnell-Biden high-level negotiation, if it's a one-off type thing, it's going to be tough to get it through the committees. It's going to be tough to get a whole lot of people to sign off on this unless everyone's holding hands. What's far more likely is you're going to have something like this be agreed to in principle, and it gets enjoined into some sort of bigger thing that has to move. And they're not going to separate some of these labor issues out, because what I've seen far too often in some of these labor issues is they get quite contentious. Even stuff that doesn't seem to be that big of a deal or may seem like common sense, it becomes a proxy for, are you for Biden or against Biden, especially with all the messaging tools. And so that's one way to look at it too. If they decide that it's too hard to get legislation through and they just want to do something through an order, it still matters what's going on in the House, and it still matters who has the majority in the Senate, because you can put tremendous pressure on nominees as they're getting confirmed. You can put tremendous pressure through the appropriation process. You can have multiple hearings. You can call people in. And so if they do decide that they're going to do something that is too far to the left, too progressive, and you have a Republican Senate, that's where the fight's going to be. And there's going to be tremendous pushback there. And you're going to see it articulated through the committees and through hearings. And then, of course, through appropriation language, which then you bring Biden back into the fold because he has to sign those bills. And so there's going to be discussions. But what I think is going to be different this time around than what we've seen in the Obama administration and the Trump administration is, I think these discussions are going to be done with a little bit more respect for one another. Number one, the margins are closer in the House and the Senate, so you're going to need to do that. You just can't continue to poke the other side. You don't have enough votes. And number two, they know that they got an executive that may be a little bit more sharp-elbowed, in part because of their own behavior. They know that. And it is not lost on any of them that perhaps turning the temperature down and having some conversations that are much more focused on the policy and a lot less personal is probably the way to go.
Okay.
I agree with Josh's analysis there about how close it's going to be. It's going to be very, very hard federally to do something on a legislative point, whether it's the TIP Act or increase wages or the gig economy. But Mike, what it does with Joe Biden in the presidency, it gives all these states cover, the blue states, if you will, to actually increase some of or implement these policies. And that's where he gives them a lot of cover. Well, I'm all for it. I can't get it through the Senate, but it's going to give. I mean, I'm in Michigan, okay, and our legislature wouldn't pass it. But Detroit's economy is different than here in the Upper Peninsula. Or you mentioned New York City, how high cost of living there. But if they pass something like that, the New York legislature and Governor Cuomo signs it, what does it do to the businesses who are up in northern by the Finger Lakes up there in New York and outside of Massachusetts, Boston, okay, but then what about in the outskirts? The president can implement things, and the states always act faster than the federal government, and that's where I see it going, more of a philosophical argument, and you're going to have plenty of people on the left in the House of Representatives demanding that their state and the government do it. So we got a long ways to go, and it's going to be a very interesting 4 years. But I think you're going to see a lot more cooperative. And what does Mitch McConnell need? And I think Mitch McConnell and President-elect Biden can work together. They did all those years in the Senate. So I think it's going to be a very interesting dance up there between the president and the Senate.
Thank you, Congressman. So let's turn to the reason many people signed in, other than to see the Brett Favre, Aaron Rodgers jersey and the Max Scherzer jersey and the Nationals jumping up and down on the field. Many of you joined today because today is a CLE event. The code for today's event is Employment 2020. And to get our CLE credits, we've been talking about a lot of possible legal issues. I want to go over some technical NLRB, or National Labor Relations Board, topics. The president will obviously have the right to get a labor secretary, and hopefully this labor secretary nominee will get confirmed. He'll also make appointments to the National Labor Relations Board, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and a variety of other agencies. As regards the NLRB, we talked about the PRO Act a little bit. The Trump Labor Board was pretty active. And what we're going to see is President-elect Biden is going to be able to appoint a majority of NLRB members. There are 5, and he's going to be able to influence that board. And what I wanted to point out to the audience today, because there's been a lot of debate on these topics over the last couple of years, that there will likely be, through NLRB enforcement proceedings and other proceedings, significant changes in what I consider to be 3 important areas. First is the specialty healthcare case, which the NLRB allowed for sort of micro-unit organizing, or organizing of smaller bargaining units and not bigger bargaining units. The historical theory is that makes union organizing easier. We'll see a pushback to micro-unit organizing and ease of organizing. I think we'll see a rescission or change in the Purple Communications case. The area there is dealing with the use of email and social media, and an employee's right to say things, adverse things about an employer over social media, whether it's the employer's social media or not. I think that still remains to be litigated and debated a bit more, but that's going to be a big area. And then we're going to see a push, in my opinion, and a change again for those labor lawyers and joint employer aficionados on the webcast here, the Browning-Ferris case under the Obama administration, the rules around who is or isn't a joint employer, where 2 entities have responsibility over a workforce. There was a joint employer relationship under the Obama administration. If you met certain criteria, the Trump administration narrowed the areas wherein you could be a joint employer. And I happen to believe that we're going to see a push back in the other direction, and there'll be more findings of joint employer status for contingent workforces, temporary workers, seasonal workers, agency workers, et cetera. And those are very important areas as to who has liability to pay taxes and make contributions to union healthcare funds and other things. I'd be remiss in this space if I don't mention that in our practice, we've seen across the country, given the number of people in certain industries who've been out of work, food service, hospitality, where you have unionized workforces and people are not working, they're thereby not getting paid for the hours of getting contributions to the healthcare funds or the other funds that unions have based on the hours worked by the employees. We're starting to see a lot of financial stress, if you will, as among those funds. I saw the congressman nodding his head on this topic. It's going to be a very important topic, and no one should be surprised if the Biden administration is lobbied, quite frankly, on the issue of supporting and helping some of these major, large, multi-billion-dollar funds in terms of their current financial struggles. I anticipate that happening literally right out of the box. And Congressman, I wonder if you have any thoughts on that topic about the various the very big union funds and some of the financial struggles that they may see and the federal government may help out on.
Sure, we've seen it, and I've worked on both in Congress and as a lawyer at Venable and as a lobbyist at Venable on trying to get some pension fund relief, especially for these union pension funds, whether it's central states or northeastern states, whatever. But the people you spoke of, these unions, SEIU and a lot of them, steel workers, are the so-called essential workers. If I can use the word, and I don't mean it respectfully, the janitor, the custodian, the person stocking the shelf, those are the pension funds that are going under. And the multi-employer comes into play here too, because one succeeds the other, and with one's in bankrupt, there's all kinds of issues with which I'm sure our listeners are well aware of. But remember, when we did the loans to the auto industry, to Chrysler and GM, that was the big issue, was what do you do with these pension and the legacy costs? These companies, GM and Chrysler, went bankrupt. So what did you do with it? Well, they basically handed it over to the union, said, okay, we're going to give you so much money, and they call it a verba, and you invest it and you take care of it. Every year we'll give you a payment, but union and employees, it's up to you to invest it wisely to make sure the money's there. And they got out from that relief. So are you going to see more of that, especially with this pandemic? And you said less contributions to these plans, greater responsibilities because you got increased healthcare costs across the country because of the pandemic. Do they just throw up their hands and say, we can't do it, federal government, you got to help us? So I said the Biden administration, their appointees thus far has been seasoned veterans in industry and in government. And it's hard to argue. You helped out General Motors and Chrysler, so why don't you bail us out for our costs that we couldn't maintain these generous benefits during a pandemic? And this pandemic's going to go on for a year before we can get country halfway vaccinated. So I think there will be a lot of movement, and I think you're going to find an administration very sympathetic to exactly what you said.
Well, that would be a relief to those big, and for the folks on the line, and many of you know this, we're talking about billions and billions of dollars. They're multi-billion-dollar funds, and some of them are in, as the congressman pointed out, some of them are in difficult financial shape right now, particularly coming out of the hospitality, food service, and other industries where there are no restaurants open, or very few, many hotels suffering, no tourism, no real travel, etc. There's two topics I'd like to just make sure I touch upon. There's many labor and employment law topics we could talk about, but here we have a president-elect who served so many years, served our government for so many years and our country for so many years. And so there's a lot out there that we could say that President-elect Biden's going to work on. In the arbitration space, this is very important for employers that use arbitration agreements as a condition of employment. Joe Biden has indicated he'll support the Forced Arbitration and Justice Repeal, or the FAIR Act. The FAIR Act was introduced and had very little chance of being passed. It was introduced, I think, in 19, the Republican majority in the Senate, and Donald Trump in the White House were not going to let that get by. But if reintroduced, there's a chance that will be given some much more serious consideration and maybe even pass. And I think Josh made the very good point. It would depend how that would get packaged. And on the government contracting side, it's a very big and important issue. Lots of money involved. I would assume, Congressman, you might agree with this, that Joe Biden would probably revoke the executive order on combating race and sex stereotyping. That, Trump made some big changes there, very controversial changes, given the way the country had been evolving and many people had been evolving and thinking had been evolving. And that executive order, I think, will get reversed and will go back to the way it used to be done. Thoughts on those two? And then we'd be remiss if we don't discuss a very important topic with you, given your service to the country. We have to get to the ACA and its effect on employers.
Sure, I would agree to that executive order by the President Trump would be overturned in a heartbeat by President Obama. And when we were talking a little bit about arbitration, it just triggered a thought too. I know we talked a lot here about employers and employees and the pandemic. What about immunity? That was one of, or liability protection for employers who do everything they think they've been doing right and bring their employees back, and one or two get sick. Are they then liable? And I know Mitch McConnell wanted that to be part of the last COVID relief package. Well, you still had President Trump, who probably would have signed it. I think that it becomes much more difficult with the new Congress and especially with the new president. And from what I've seen thus far, and Josh may want to jump in, I don't think there's anything in the $905 billion package, that bipartisan package, about immunity protection or liability protection, whatever you want to call it, but liability protection for employers. So in this space, employment and labor, that has to be an issue that has to be addressed. And I'd be interested. Josh, did you see it in the 905 bill, the compromise bill? Well,
I
Go ahead, Mike.
I have a sneaking suspicion we had a technological problem on Josh's end. Max Scherzer was signed by the Yankees, so they're in palpitation down there in Washington.
Yeah, Josh is under his desk by now.
So let's talk about that a second, though. The employer shield, or the shield for retail entities or other entities, much debated months ago, and yet there's silence. There appears to be silence on that now. Josh appears to be back now. Have you heard anything about the employer shield, or sort of a retail business owner shield from liability
from the pandemic?
Coming into this.
Sure. Yeah. So apologize. I got overwhelmed by all my Nats memorabilia, and I got cut off. And so, yes, look, liability in a COVID bill is one of the top priorities of Senate Majority Leader McConnell. And whether or not you agree it needs to be there or not, he has stuck to that since day one. And he will not agree to anything unless it's in there. And it's been kind of this point of contention between the House and the Senate. And take away the numbers, the $2 trillion and the $500 billion. This has been a major issue that they've never seen eye to eye on. And there's compelling reasons on either side as to whether it's necessary or not. And I'm not going to get into that. But I will tell you that when this Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, determines that he's going to take a stand on something, good luck getting something done unless you are able to acknowledge it or scratch that itch somehow. And there's been very little reason why Democrats have wanted to do that now. So I would expect if they do get some sort of deal, there will be something in there. How strong it is, I'm not certain. How far back it goes, it's tough to prove that you got sick because you went into this bakery on this day. So there's kind of some elements to this that are difficult, but it is my experience in following this Senate Majority Leader. When he digs his heels in, they stay in.
So I said we'd be remiss if we don't at least discuss the ACA, and I know that the Affordable Care Act, for the audience, the Supreme Court decision that's going to come out at some point, I don't know if it'll be soon, will have a big impact. And I guess Congressman Stupak. So we've had this, debate, I guess, going back to the run-up to the 2016 election about, repeal and replace or whatever it was. Not exactly sure how it all shook out. You I know have done a lot of work in this space, and from an employer's perspective, it would seem to me that a Biden administration will robustly and vigorously support the Obama administration efforts under the ACA within the confines of the law. Again, we're waiting for a Supreme Court decision on that. And I would think that they would try to enhance the requirements on employers as regards providing benefits to employees moving forward. Thoughts on that topic?
Sure. And President-elect Biden said, first of all, I'm going to strengthen the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, if you will, but then I'm going to offer a public option. If you remember back in 2009, the House actually did pass a public option. The public option was nothing more than saying this: Mr. Employer, Mr. and Mrs. Employer, you have to provide health care for all your folks. If you don't, then you pay into this fund. Employees, you must have health care. If you don't, then you have to come into the public option or pay the fine. So when you really look at the Joe Biden plan, when he ran for president here, I'm going to fix the Affordable Care Act as I can. But I'm going to go towards this public option, which is a self-insured fund, much like Medicare, where it's paid for by premiums that the employee and employer pay. And I really believe it's a glide path to Medicare for all that you've heard so much about, that the more liberal wing of the Democratic Party has been pushing for some time. So I see a lot happening in healthcare. If I was an employer right now, I would probably say, I hope the Affordable Care Act is not stricken down by the Supreme Court. And, again, being a lawyer, I don't think they're going to do it, because you got to pass three hurdles. First of all, does the plaintiff have standing to even bring the case? Secondly, if there's no penalty, because they've done away with the individual mandate, well, they didn't do away with it. They said right now there's zero penalty. So how are you harmed, plaintiff, before the Supreme Court? And finally, there's the doctrine of severability that even Justice Comey Barrett mentioned, that just because that part would found unconstitutional doesn't mean the whole law is unconstitutional. If they're attacking it because there's no more individual mandate, so take away the individual mandate, does the rest of the law have to fall? So for employers and employers especially, I would hope that the ACA would stay, not be struck down by Supreme Court. If he goes to a public option, it's really a requirement upon employers, whoever he or she may be, to provide coverage for their employees. And an employee can always opt out, but the burden basically comes back to the employers. That's where most people get their health insurance, and it's an expansion of what has already been working in this country for many, many years.
Josh, any thoughts on the ACA? I have one other topic before we open it up to questions, because we've exhausted 55 minutes already.
I would just say on the ACA, Republicans don't have a sterling history of being able to come up with either a solution or the votes to move forward on an issue. And they still don't have a robust plan as to what the replacement would be. And so there is concern that if the Supreme Court were to strike down the law, there's a little bit of a dog that caught the bumper of, okay, now what? And so I think that there's absolutely some questions that Republicans have not been able to answer in the past, and they have not shown that they're able to answer those today. So we'll see.
Thank you. So the last sort of substantive topic I thought we should definitely raise, it affects employers, will be, I think we're going to see the Biden administration try to help businesses more to use immigration to strengthen their businesses. I think we're going to see this talk of a potential points-based immigration system, expanding the number of sort of highly skilled visas that would be available in different industries, and eliminating caps on certain countries. So I think we can expect to see some pushes in those areas. So we have a couple of minutes left. I don't know if there are any questions in the question box. I don't see any, but why don't I turn to Josh first for final comments, and then Congressman Stupak, and we can wrap up.
Yeah, no, a pleasure to be here. And Mike, if I can just go back to your initial comments, this is the first time that the Nationals have won the World Series, and I would love to see some swag from the first time the Yankees won the World Series. I think that would be absolutely appropriate to put up and celebrate. I will also say this, unlike the Yankees, I have no idea when the Nationals will ever be back. I think we can count on the Yankees to do it much more often than the Nationals ever will. In general, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. I think that there's a lot of gray area and fog as to exactly how things may shake out in labor and employment, but you can count on some definite metrics, and Georgia is one of them. And then following whoever the outcome is with the leadership there, how that shakes out is going to be really important. And so really appreciate the opportunity. And again, if you have any questions or follow-up that you want to discuss, we're here all the time. We follow this stuff consistently and try to guide our clients through the day-to-day muck that is Capitol Hill.
Congressman Stupak.
Well, thanks. And keeping with the sports analogy there, we have one administration coming to an end, a new one coming up to the plate to bat, starting off the new administration, and they have a solid fielding team of seasoned pros. So you think they would be favorite as we go through the next 4 years. But I am hopeful that we tone down the rhetoric in this country and we get back to work in a bipartisan manner, and we can move and address on these issues. As you saw today, there's no one side right or the other side's wrong on these issues we discussed. There's merit on both sides, but we need reasonable people in the legislature, in the U.S. Congress, and the presidency to sit down and discuss it and make some practical, logical decisions to move this country forward. And with that, I'll throw it back to you.
Thank you. So, folks, thanks for joining today. Again, the code for CLE purposes is Employment 2020. We've covered a lot of different topics. There's a question on whether or not we'll have a slide deck posted or available. We do have a small slide deck. My Labor and Employment Law Group publishes stuff every couple of weeks. We can, to the person that asked that question, we can get you on the list of people that receive our information. Josh's crowd puts stuff out literally every day at times during the year, depending on how activities are carrying on down in Washington and across the country. The labor and employment space will probably be a very active space in the next, certainly year and a half, and then for the 4 years of the Biden administration. But I say thank you to Josh for his work today and his work in general for our firm and for our clients. And thank you to Congressman Stupak for joining us today. It was a lively and I found interesting discussion. So thank you both for your time.
Pleasure.
Thank you, everyone.